We're on Daf Mem Zayin Omid Beis to be precise, and we're up to Esvei Abaye, which is approximately 10 lines down from the top of the Yom. Abaye is again raising an objection against Rabbah, who holds from Hoil, which means that if you're Ofeh from Yom Tov to Shabbos, or for that matter from Yom Tov to Chol, we can always anticipate the possibility of Orchim showing up. And now we're going to study a Brisa. The Brisa we began discussing yesterday, and I'd like to make some progress on this Brisa. The Brisa is again listing the possibility of getting multiple malchus for one action, in this case, 5 different sets of malchus. We're going to try to subdivide these 5 categories of malchus into 2 major categories. Gid HaNasheh b'Chol b'Yontif v'Ochlo Loke Chamesh. He cooks Gid HaNasheh together with Cholov on Yontif, and he eats it. He gets 5 sets of malchus. And now the Brisa enumerates these 5. Number 1, Loke Mishum Mevashel Gid B'Yontif. Although Bishul is a Meleches Ochel Nefesh, which is permissible on Yontif, but not so if it's not Royal Achila. In this case, the Torah joins you from eating Gid HaNasheh, and therefore the cooking of Gid HaNasheh is not considered a Meleches Ochel Nefesh. It's one of the Melachos, and it incurs a חיוב malchus. Number 2, Loka Mishum Ochel Gid. He ate the Gid HaNasheh, and the Torah says, Al Kein Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael's Gid HaNasheh. We read it just 2 weeks ago. And V'Loka Mishum Mevashel Basar B'Cholav. And this has to do with the sugya of Yesh Begidin B'no Saint Tam or Ein Begidin B'no Saint Tam. We're assuming now Yesh Begidin B'no Saint Tam, and the Gid has the status of Basar, and therefore, to the same extent that you violate a חיוב malchus for eating basar, you violate a חיוב malchus for eating Gid HaNasheh. And not only that, if you cook Gid HaNasheh together with chalav, it's as if you cook basar, the flesh of the animal, together with chalav. And you get malchus for bishul. You get malchus not only for bishul of Yontif, but also for bishul of basar b'chalav. The Torah says, Lo svachel gedi b'chalevi mo. Now, we have another חיוב malchus because he ate the Gid HaNasheh. Now you tell me that you violated bishul of basar b'chalav, and ipso facto, by eating this concoction, you violate the Isur of Achilas basar b'chalav, and you get another set of malchus for that. Of course, you might argue that the Torah only says Lo savashel gedi b'chalevi, but the Gemara in Chulin says that Lo savashel gedi applies in 3 different manifestations, because the Torah repeats it thrice. Once for the Isur Bishul, twice a second malchus for the חיוב Achila, and the third for Hana. Next, Loka Mishum Havara. We're back to Yontif again. And we have for Achila, we have number 1, Achilas Gid, number 2, Achilas Basar b'Cholav. And now for Bishul, we have number 1, the Isur Bishul of Yontif, number 2, the Isur Bishul of Basar b'Cholav. And now, when he turns on the fire on Yontif, he's Chayav Mishum Meleches Havara for creating an Eish. Even though Havara, again, is your classic Ochel Nefesh Malach, but not in the case of Gid, and certainly not Gid with Cholav, which is Basar b'Cholav. It's not Litzarech Ochel Nefesh. So let's see if we can count up 5 Chiyuvei Malchus in this case, and divide them into 2 groups. One group is a Bishul group. The other group is the Achila group. In the case of the Bishul group, we're talking about number 1, Bishul on Yontif. Number 2, Bishul of Basar b'Cholav. Number 3, Havara, turning on the fire for the purpose of Bishul on Yontif. So he's got 2 violations of Yontif and 1 violation of Basar b'Cholav, as far as Bishul is concerned. Now we go over to Achila. He ate Gid HaNasheh. He ate Basar b'Cholav. We're assuming now the Yesh Begin B'no Saint Tam, and therefore the Gid has the same status as Basar, and he eats Basar b'Chalev Imo. he violates the Isur Bishul because Losav Hashel Gedi, and then the extra Losav Hashel Gedi for the Isur Achila Basa B'Chol. All told, we have 5. Now, once we introduce Rabba's sheet of Hoil, then there are going to be 2 problems in this brisa, both of which have to do with Bishul on Yom Tov. One is the actual Bishul, which we're claiming is Shalol L'Tzorech Ochel Nefesh. And in the case of Gid HaNasheh, it's very difficult to imagine Hoil. But when we get to the Meleches Havara, when he turns on the fire, here's a perfect example to take the abstract principle of Rabbah and apply it in this case of a fire that could be used for many different purposes on Yom Tov, which is called Litzarka. He might need the fire for light purposes. He may need the fire for heat purposes. He may use the fire to cook that which is mutter on Yom Tov. Why do we assume, therefore, in this brisa, and this is going to be Abai's objection to Rabbah, that he gets Malchus for Meleches Havara? Why not apply the principle of Hoil? And the Gemara says, "V'yamrin Hoil Havara lo l'chayv hol v'chazi le litzarke." It's roy litzarko. Now, let's just point out the obvious. Bishul and Havara are 2 separate malachos in the counting of the 39 malachos. Each one individually will generate on Yom Tov Malchus, on Shabbos even a Chiyuv Skila. However, with regard to Mavir, it's not so clear that there is a malach of Mavir on Yom Tov. Our premise that there are 39 malachas on Shabbos and ipso facto 39 malachas on Yom Tov is not necessarily so. I might be able to take 1 malacha out of the bag. And that's based on a shita at the beginning of Masechet Pesachim, which is called Havara Lilav Yotzes. Why did the Torah have to say Lo Sevaru Eish B'Chomosh V'Seichem Yom HaShabbos? It should be included under the malachas. So one man the Yomer says L'Chalik Yotzes. That has to do with how many karbonos you bring in cases of shkagos when you violated more than 1 malacha b'heli machas. That's not relevant to us. But the other man the Yomer says L'Chalik Yotzes, Lilav Yotzes. And Lilav Yotzes means that the Torah actually took Mavir out of the bag of malachos, downgraded it to the level of a lav, and means on Shabbos we have a level of a lav of prohibiting Havara on Shabbos. That has no application to Yom Tov. The Torah with regard to Yom Tov has no Isur lav of Havara. Nowhere does it appear in the Torah. You'll ask me, Malacha. Well, if you assume that Havara is a Malacha like any other Malacha, then the Torah says, Kol Malachas Avodah Lo Tasu on Yom Tov. You're enjoined from doing malacha, unless it's l'tzorech achal nefesh. Our case here is not l'tzorech achal nefesh, unless we introduce Hoil, because he's turning on the fire for the purpose of cooking Gid HaNasheh, and none the least together with challah. But if I would assume Havara lilav yotzes, that means that Havara on Shabbos is only a lav. Well, the Torah says b'yom HaShabbos. The Torah doesn't say that there's an Isa Havara and a lav on Yom Tov. Our sugya at this point is apparently assuming Havara lechalik yotzes, which means that Havara is a malacha. If it qualifies as a malacha with regard to Shabbos, then ipso facto, it's included in Kol Meleches Avodah Lo Sasu on Yom Tov, and it would incur malchus if it would shalol litzar. Now, Rashi here doesn't point out what he emphasizes in a parallel sugya in Masechet Beitza. There, Rashi tells us that the Tana of this brisa holds from a principle of chiluk malachos b'Yun Tov, which means the following: if in one maisa a person could violate 2 different malachos, will he get, we're talking about Yom Tov, malchus for each one of those 2 malachos in one maisa? And that's a gigantic machlokes in Masechet Beitza, And Rashi says that this brisa could only be understood in light of the shita that says yesh chiluk malachas b'yontiv, which means that if he violates 2 malachas on yontiv with 1 maisa, he incurs 2 chiyuvei malchus, because we're trying to calculate the number 5. And amongst the number 5, we have both bishul and avara. The other Rishonim are not convinced that Rashi is correct, because the havara takes place before the actual bishul. He turns on the fire, he fills up a pot with Gid HaNasheh, and then he adds milk into the pot, and he puts the pot on top of the fire. He violates Meleches Bishul subsequent to violating Meleches Havara. And if that be the case, even if I would hold Ein Chiluk Malachas Liyontiv, and 1 Maisa could not generate 2 different Chiyuvei Malchus for violating 2 different Malachas with 1 Maisa on Yontiv, but nevertheless, if the Maisim happen in sequence, for Zechar Zeh, then even that Mandiyama would agree that Yesh Chiluk Malachas B'Iyun. And therefore, Tosfos and other Rishonim are not convinced that Rashi in Beitza is correct, that we have to commit this brisa to the position of Yesh Chiluk Malachas B'Iyun. Amalek, Rabbah is so overwhelmed by this objection of Abaye with this brisa of Havara, where is Hoil, that he's willing to play with the girsa and rewrite the text of the brisa. This is very atypical. Again, if the Gemara has a kasha which cannot be answered by any Mandiyomar, then if need be, as a fallback position, we'll change the girsa. But here, the Gemara has a raya for the Shita of Chizda that we don't apply the principle of Hoil, and this is an objection to Rabbah, and instead we're going to say, according to Rabbah, take out the word Avara. Now again, you can play around with the word Avara, but one thing you can't tamper with. This is Kodesh Kadoshim. It says Chamesh Malchus. So that means, like in the old game of Taryag Mitzvahs, of counting the mitzvahs, that if you take out one, you got to substitute another. So that if Rabbah will take the literary liberty of removing Havara from this enumerated list in the Bryce as we have it, he somehow has to come up with another malach or another violation of a chiyuv malchus. And Amalei, so Rabbah says, Apik Havara, take Havara out. It does not say in the Brisa, Loke Mishum Havara, cross it out. The aisle, and in its place, Gid HaNasheh Shel Nevela. Now, we didn't know exactly whether or not Gid HaNasheh, in this case, in the Brisa, was a shchuta or a nevela. In both cases, there's an isolav of Gid HaNasheh. And there's no reason to assume up front that the Gid HaNasheh described in this Brisa is a Gid HaNasheh of a nevela. Now, we're holding in this Brisa that Yesh Begidim B'no Sein Tam. And I'll prove it to you. Because it says that you get malchus for bishul basar b'cholov. Where's the basar over here? He only cooked Gid HaNasheh. It must be the Gid HaNasheh's basar because yesh begin b'no sein tam. If yesh begin b'no sein tam, then if this gid was removed from a carcass of an animal that died without shchita, then in addition to the malchus that he gets for eating Gid HaNasheh, he also gets another set of malchus for eating nevela. Again, that's all assuming the predicate of yesh begin b'no sein tam. So Abai is not happy with this answer of Rabbah. Come on, give it a break for Tani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia in the Brisa, in the case of Gid HaNasheh that was cooked with chalav on Yom Tov, and he ate it, is Rabbi Chia says, Lokesh Shtayim ala chilaso. In other words, he has a categorization of this Brisa. He takes the Brisa of Chamesh Malchus, and he divides it into 2 categories. One category is Malchus for Achila, and the other is Malchus for Bishul. In the case of Malchus for Achila, Rabbi Chia counts 2 Malchus. In the case of Malchus for Bishul plus Havara, of course, he calculates 3 Malchus. Now watch what happens. If you have our girsa, namely that one of the chiyuv of the 5 chiyuv malchus incurred in this brisa is for havara, then it fits beautifully. Shalosh al bishula. Why? Because in the preparation of this cooked tavchil, which is Gid HaNasheh with challah, he has violated bishul 3 times. He turns on the fire, which is shalol tzarech, and then he puts the pot with Gid HaNasheh on top of the fire. That's already bishul of Yom Tov, bishul of Gid HaNasheh. Plus, he adds milk into the mixture, and he now incurs the violation of bishul basa b'challah. So for the bishul process, Rav Chia is absolutely right. If you assume the girs of Avara, then he violates 3 chiyuvei malchus. There are 2 chiyuvei machila, another 2 chiyuvei malchus to round it off at 5, and that's for eating Gid HaNasheh and eating basa b'challah. But according to you, Rabbah, Sami Mikan, if you are removing Havara from the list and instead you are substituting Nevela, then it turns out that Rav Chia is very lopsided, because in fact you're violating 3 chiyuvei malchus for achila and 2 for bishul. Ella says, Rabbah, you're right. I gotta rewrite the script here. Go back to home plate and hit the ball a little bit better this time. I'm going to have to supply a substitute for avara that incurs a chiyuv malchus for bishul. How so? Ela apik avara, take out avara, that he has to do because of the principle of hoil. The ayil atze mukt. We always assume that muktzah is the rabbanon. That's because we didn't learn Pesachim Daf Mem Zayin. Had we learned Pesachim Daf Mem Zayin, we would have come, at least at this point in the sugya, to an entirely different conclusion, and namely that Atze Muktzah and violating Nisa Muktzah is a doraisa. Not only is it a doraisa, but it incurs a chiyuv malchus. The hersta maisa. Again, I have to admit my ignorance. I was never aware of this. To me, muktzah, the Gemara says at the end of Beitzah, is atu tiltul. In other words, we're afraid that if you pick up muktzah, you might carry it out into Rishus HaRabim and violate atu atzah, excuse me, is the language of the Gemara. Or perhaps muktzah is an Isur which Rabbanan instituted in order to have what's called a shvisa nikeres, that your experience on Shabbos should be different than your experience on Chol, so that lo yehei tiltulcha b'Shabbos kil tiltulcha b'Chol. Alternatively, let's say if a case of muktzah and ner, we're afraid you might come to put out the candle and violate meleches kibui, and so forth. You know, you have a kli shemlachtel Isur, you might violate the Isur if we allow you to move around the kli. But our Gemara says, Atze Mukt. What logs did he use on Yontif to cook his Gid HaNasheh? If he used logs that he had prepared before Yontif, he's got his shed where he keeps logs for the campfire for the fire, then that's not muktzah. That was already muchan. That was prepared specifically for burning on Yontif. However, he didn't prepare these logs. So he takes logs and he uses them as firewood on Yontif without hachana. And that's called atze muktzah. Do you hear? Atze muktzah. Now he's assuming that Atze Muktzah is Asur min HaTorah. Now we have to ask two questions. One, where does it say in the Torah that Atze Muktzah are prohibited? Secondly, we have to ask another question. What about Hoil? Meaning that just like Rabbah was in deep trouble with Havara because he can use the Havara, the fire litzarko, so when he takes the Atze Muktzah and he puts them into the campfire, and he makes a fire for the purpose of cooking Gid HaNasheh, that could also be hoil. That could also be litzarko. Now, Abaye is going to reject Rabbah because Abaye holds that muksa is the Rabbanan, which is very comforting for me. But according to Rabbah, if muksa is doraisa, we have to find a source for it. We could be very comfortable with Abaye, but we Rabbah is no slouch. If Rabbah says that muksa is doraisa, then we have to have a source for it. And then we have to answer the question why there's no holy. So I want to share with you the following two comments. He says the following. Number one, how do we square Rabbah, that muktzah is min Torah, with the Gemara at the end of Masechet Shabbos? The Gemara says, and this is a historical fact, which Rabbah cannot deny, that during the time of Nehemiah was a little bit before Rabbah, was he not? Gazru al Iser Tiltul, which means muktzah. So the Gzera, and I emphasize that word Gzera of muktzah, dates back to the time of Nehemiah. The Gadru Kadesh Lo Yavo Lasos Iser B'Melecha Shabbos. It's a Gzera. Comes along the Chassam Sofer in a valiant attempt to salvage this sugya that Rabbah holds at muktzah's doraisa. And he says the following, that Kisha ochel o mishtamech b'davar shaya muktzah u'mechusar achana yalfinan mivechinu es asher yaviu so also lechol b'Shabbos davar shaya mucham erev Shabbos v'chein also l'shtamech b'chol davar shaloya muchan erev Shabbos the kol shaloya muchan me esmo sheisiach dato mimenu. And he gives a whole bunch of different reasons, is therefore asur min Torah, and that's called hishtamsh. So Rabbosai, let's understand that the Chassam Sofer is dealing with three categories. He's combining two and separating the third. The first two categories are achila and ishtamshus. And the third category is tilt. When the Torah says v'chinu es asher yaviu, it means that whatever you need to bring the food in the case of man, and whatever food you want to eat on Shabbos requires hachana. And this at the beginning of Masechet Beitza is the famous sugya of hachana de Rabbah. No coincidence, it's the same Rabbah here in Masechet Pesachim. And we're dealing with a requirement min Torah to prepare food for eating and kalim or any other object for hishtamshus. Tiltul is an under zach. And when the Gemara says at the end of Shabbos that tiltul is a gzera, which dates back to Nehemiah, the Gemara is talking about something which even Rabbah would agree is not included in the Isa Doraisa derived from Hachana, but rather in a new category, which is a Gzera D'Rabbanan that applies to tiltul. So that the Rabbanan in this Gzera are breaking new ground. The Torah's requirement of Hachana was limited, restricted to A, Achila, and B, Ishtamshus. And now the Rabbanan are expanding it through the Gzera, entering into a new category, which is called tiltul. And that's a Gzera D'Rabbanan. Now, am I happy? Yes. Am I totally happy? No. I'm happy because I think that Chassam Sofer is really breaking new ground over here. He's really giving us a whole new perspective, a focus on muktzah, in which we can differentiate between muktzah doraisa according to Rava and piltul muktzah, which is a gzeira even according to Rava. But I'm not happy because at the end of the day, the only source for muktzah in Torah is v'yichinu es asher yaviu. If you want, you could call it an isur aseh. You know what we call a lav haba mechal eseh. The Torah is telling you to prepare. What do you mean to prepare? Do I have to put on special begadim and recite Hineni Muchar V'Zuman when I prepare my food for Shabbos, or I prepare my logs for a fire on Yom Tov? I wouldn't call it a mitzvah saseh and count it in Taryag. Nay, the Torah is just telling you that don't use or eat that which has no hachon. But Ribono Shel Olam, we have laws and rules for malchus. I mean, there's a whole Masechet on this. And you only get malchus if you violate a lav in the Torah. Where's the lav in the Torah? It's not enough to convince me that according to Rabbah, muktzah is min Torah. What Rabbah is doing now, he's going back to the Brisa of Chia, calculating 5 sets of malchus, one of which is because he uses atzei muktzah for the purpose of burning a fire and cooking his Gid HaNasheh. I don't understand how that could generate malchus. And he says, midin Torah mutal etaltel v'rak v'mein chemya ben chachalya gozra al tiltul machmat shayu mezalzelin and prutzim in yonei otzar Shabbos. Fine. That is wonderful. I don't see how you get malchus for violating hachon. So Rabbi said, at this point, I'm going to leave that question unanswered. I want to move on to the next question that we have. What about Hoil? Rabbah is the flag waver of Hoil. Why doesn't Hoil apply to Hishtamshus Biatze Mukt? He says, "V'afshat Torah hitira lasos melacha b'yontiv l'tzorach ochel nefesh, v'yochel l'shtamish ba'eich l'tzorach heter." Just like Rabbah removed Havara from the list of malchus because he may use the fire for a purpose that's ochel nefesh, is so too, let's apply Hoil in the case of burning Atzei Muktzah. He may use it for his purpose. So he says the following. This is a Torah from the Tzlach, from the Nod of Yehuda. I tried to figure this out. He says, "Mikol makom legabei iser shimush b'muktzah ein lanu lefocho mitam hoil." No hoil. Rack my brains to try to figure this out. Sharei ishtamish bohem litzorach she'eno ochol nefesh. What's he doing with these atzei muktzah? He is cooking Gid HaNasheh. There's no ochel nefesh in Gid HaNasheh. So again, in Havara, we look at the age. He created a fire. Well, that fire could be used for many different things. His intention was shalol etzorach ochel nefesh, but Rabbah always comes up with hoil, and he might be using the fire for ochel nefesh. So the malacha here, which the Torah prohibited, is creating the eish, and that he did, and now we can apply hoil. But in the case of muktzah, the Isser is not creating the eish. You mamish have to be such a lambin, so abstract. I mean, this is such a dakastika chiluk here. Says the Nod of Yehuda, the violation here is not in the creating of the fire. For that we have Meleches Havara. We're talking about a whole different Isser. And the Isser is what I call in the pudding, not in the baking of the pudding, but in the pudding. What was the shtamshus? He violates the Isser Achana at the moment in which he cooks the Gid HaNasheh. It's, I don't know if it's Bavasachas, I don't know if it's Lamafreya. I'm not sure exactly how the mechanics work according to No Yehuda. But Ishtamshus is not defined by the Maisa, but rather by the Totza'ah, by the ultimate effect or gain or benefit from the Maisa. You can't apply Hoil in this case, because the benefit itself is Shalol Tzarch Ochel Nefesh. What has he got from the fire of these logs of the Atzei Mukta? He has a piece of cooked, not only Gid HaNasheh, but Basar B'Cholah. That's not L'tzorch Ochel Nefesh. And it's amazing to me because the Yehuda was 100 years before the Chassam Sofer. But yet it sounds like the Yehuda is standing on the shoulders of the Chassam Sofer, which means that he understood the Yehuda, just like the Chassam Sofer clarified, that when we say that according to Rava, Muktzah is Doraisa, we're not talking about Tiltul Muktzah, that's the Rabbanon, but the Shtamshus B'Muktzah. I would almost compare it to Issurei Hana, that in Muktzah, according to Rava, the Torah prohibits you from benefiting from the Muktzah. And now, when we define the benefit, then we'll know what is the nature of the Avera. The nature of the Avera is the benefit. Again, he can benefit from it in a million different ways. I couldn't care less. But the benefit itself is the violation of the Issurim. And there's no way that you could say that that benefit was the Tzarech Ochel Nefesh, because it's Gid HaNasheh and Basar B'Cholah to boot. Is therefore says the Yehuda lo yahafech es hashimush l'tzarech ochel nefesh l'mafreya. You cannot say l'mafreya with regard to shimush, because the shimush itself defines the shimush. What benefit did he get from the Atzei Mukta? He got Gid HaNasheh, cooked Gid HaNasheh. The Havi Kamo Malacha Chadasha. Interesting how the language of the Yehuda, he's like creating a whole new category of malach. We know that there are 39 malachas. Well, the truth is there are 40 malachas. There's a new malacha. Ke'ein malacha chadash, he calls it, called muktzah, which means shimush b'davar shalom muchan mibodyo. And whatever shimush you have, the aver is in the shimush. You start by lighting a fire on these muktzah logs. That's a malachas havara. That's not this new malacha. This new malacha is when you put the pot with Gid HaNasheh in this case on top of the fire. That's the completion, or shall we say, that generates the violation of the Isur D'Oraisa, according to Rabbah, of Ishtamshus B'Muktzah. And it's impossible to say Hoil that it's Litzor. Now, he has a kasha here, which I'm not sure I understand. The Gemara said, with a valiant attempt, to say that it's Gid HaNasheh Shel Nevela. We rejected that because that would jack up the number of Isurei Achila. You get Malchus for Nevela. And that would tip the scale in the wrong direction. And instead of having 2 violations of Achila that incur Malchus and 3 of Bishul, it now becomes 2 of Bishul and 3 of Achila, because he's getting Achilas Gid, Achilas Basar B'Cholah, and now we're adding Achilas Nevela to boot. So what's he quotes here Ritva, and he says the Bali Atosa bothered by this kasha as well. Madua lo hemida habraisa b'mavashel Gid HaNasheh shel nevela v'yischayev gam mishum achilas nevela. Oh, I understand. Just 1 second. Now, let's see. Reb Chia Reb Chia, and nobody can deny this, he's got the 5 malchus broken down into 2 achilos and 3 bishos. But we're making a mistake over here, because we shouldn't be feeling complacent about the fact that Reb Chia has the number 5. We should go back to the Brisa and ask a different question. The Brisa should have said 6. There's no Xeris HaKosav here that you have to stop and top it off at 5, 2 Achila and 3 Bishul. You could add a 6th Malchus by just saying that the Gid HaNasheh came from an Avela, meaning this Brisa fits into those, I don't know, that genre of Brises and Mishnayos that try to show you how in one Maisa you could maximize your chiyuvim and violations with myriad of violations. So why stop in the number 5? Don't be stingy. Add to the number 6. Why not say that this Gid HaNasheh came not from a slaughtered animal, but from a gepegeter animal, an avela, and therefore he violates these an avela as well. V'tiritz Ritva, he says that there are 2 styles in the Mishnayos or the Brises. We have, for example, a Mishnah in Makkas that we touched on earlier. Yesh choresh telem echad v'chayav oleh mishum shmona lav. You remember that the Charisha, and he violated Shvius, and he violated Charisha B'Yontif, and this, that, the whole, Kisei Adam, all that whole discussion. So the Brisa started with the word, actually the Mishnah, with the word yesh. Yesh choresh telem echad v'chayav mishum shmona lav. Says the Ritva, when the Mishnah opens up with the word yesh choresh telem yesh choresh telem echad chayav mishum shmona lav, mashma shebol chadesh minyan Issurim b'maisa echad. So the word yesh is an introduction to violating multiple lavim with one maisa. Ach, our brisa, lo nokta loshen zu. The ein mashmos habrisa shebol chadesh yitachen harbe isurim b'maisa echad. Ella hachidushu shebe'etzem hashalokim al advarim hamuskar. In other words, he says that sometimes the Brisa has the following agenda. How can you violate X, and let's get the highest number X as possible with one Maisa? Sometimes the purpose of the Brisa is to teach you that you're chayav in this case for this, for that, and for that, and for that, and for that. And how do you know which is the agenda of the Brisa or the Mishnah? It depends whether it opens with the word yesh. Yesh, etc. Echad, v'chayav X. Yesh choresh b'telem echad. So he did one charisha and he's chayav shmona lav. But when it doesn't have the word yesh, then it means that you're chayav for this and you're chayav for that. You're chayav for bas b'cholav, even though it's only a gid. You're chayav for v'vashal b'yontif, even though maybe archim will come, a face, whatever. So each one of the chiv malka is a chiddush in himself. There would be no chiddush in the vela. Why? Because you've already established that he's violating bas b'cholav against malchus v'achilus bas b'cholav, meaning yesh begin b'no same time. Then if it was in the vela, I understand that he'll get an additional malchus for the vela. Had the brisa that we're studying today opened like the Mishnah in Makkas with the word yesh, right? Yesh mevashel v'ochel v'chayav oleh mishum X, then we would add nevela as an addition. So Abai says, "V'chi muktzah doraisa." Are you telling me, Rabbi, that muktzah is doraisa? In Omele, yes. Which means that you have to prepare your ochlin and your hishtamshus on Erev Shabbos. And if there was no zimun and no achana, then it's not called L'tzarech Shabbos, and therefore it's us. So these eitzim that he used to be mavashel were not prepared. They weren't mezumah. He didn't say hinei muchad mezumah for these eitzim, and the Torah says that we require achana. Oh, now the Gemara is going to ask our question. Why? The Torah indicates that you need achana, but where's the law? And here's where the Noda Yehuda found his peg to hang his hat on. As harasa milosasa kol malach. What a pellet. To take muktzah and subsume it under lotasa kol malacha. Rebbeinu Shalom, where's the malacha here? He ate something that wasn't prepared before Shabbos. He used something that wasn't prepared before Shabbos. And that's called a malacha? Says the Noda Yehuda that hareu ke'ein malacha chadasha. It's like a brand new malacha. Yeah, I'm wondering what Rav Shimshon Hirsch would do with this Gemara. You know, his famous thesis that malacha means that we are imitating God, that just like God abstains from all the categories of labor with which he created the world, so too we have to abstain from those categories of labor. I don't know how he deals with Hotzah exactly, but
this is in reference to Shabbos. What about Yom Tov?
Same thing. They both are equal. Our definition of malacha and Shabbos for a חיוב skila is identical with our definition of malacha on Yom Tov for a חיוב malchus. The only difference is that in Yom Tov the Torah allows you to do a malacha l'tzarech chol nefesh. But other than that, your definition of that's why I said before that avara on Yom Tov is a question, because if you hold that avara on Shabbos is not a malacha, that's called a lav yotzes, then there's no isur avara on Yom Tov. But that's only because it's not a malacha. Once you classify something as a malacha, then there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. So therefore, Rabba expanding our definition of malacha to include even muktzah, whether it's achilas muktzah or shimush b'muktzah, that's also considered kein malacha. Then ipso facto it applies even on Yom Tov.
But the lashon is different. Lo saseh kol malacha and melechas avoda.
Right. This is a famous Ramban that the Ramban says melechas avoda is going to limit those malachos that have no relationship to ochel nefesh. If you have a malacha that's related to ochel nefesh, then that's not included in melechas avoda. I don't know how the Ramban is going to deal with this this Gemara, because the Gemara is willing to expand the definition of malacha on Yom Tov to include even muktzah. Is the Ramban going to say, therefore, that muktzah, according to Rabbah, is a kind of melechas avoda? I don't know. That's a stretch. This whole Gemara is really one radical revolution of sorts. It just undermines everything that we know about muktzah. And by the way, I don't have to tell you this, the halacha in muktzah gets very, very chamur if you look in poskim. For example, the principle of safek d'rabbanan l'kula, which should definitely apply to muktzah, nowhere will you apply it to muktzah. We will never have a safek muktzah l'kula. It's always going to be safek muktzah l'chumrah. And I think it's based on this Gemara that we're learning now, that Rabbah was of the opinion that v'chinu eshayaviu is a revelation of kol malach lo sasu, that now we're going to classify muktzah as a malacha, which again makes no sense. I'm telling you right now. It undermines everything we know about the concept of malacha and a definition thereof. Amalei. Now Abaye asks a kash on Rabbah. You tell me that the Isur muktzah is d'oraisa. For atu di amrit. After all, let me quote you yourself, Rabbah. Boy, mi name Rav Chizda. You yourself, Rabbah, once asked the following question to Rav Chizda. Fiamrile, others have a different tradition. That boy, mi name Rav Huna. The question was addressed to Rav Huna. Avi se me'afar tamid ushchato tamid b'yontif mal. What happens if he brings into the Azorah on Yom Tov a seh that came from far away? It was out in the Afar. Afar means that's the place outside the city limits where the animals graze and they eat grass out there, but it's me'afar. That's called mukt, because usually when the animals go out to graze in the afar, they go out there for a long period of time, sometimes even 6 months. And your Mesiach Das, you have no anticipation that these animals will all of a sudden knock on your door and show up. They come in from the afar, I should say. And the question is, are you allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov? Meaning, since there was no zimun, you did not prepare these animals before Yom Tov, would there be a problem of muktzah? Now what happens, and the plot grows thick over here, it's more complicated. Chato, he shechts it for the purpose of the tamid shel tzibur b'yantif, right? The carbon tamid is doche yantif. But on the other hand, the Yisur Muktzah applies. So you have now an overlap between Muktzah and Shchitas Karban Tamid. The Shchita of the Karban Tamid is certainly mutter, but the animal itself is Muktzah. Does that invalidate the Karban, which would undermine the Ritzui, the Kapara of the Karban, and it's no longer Karban Tamid? We have to bring a new Karban Tamid from animals that were here locally, not coming from the afar. They weren't coming from far away, and they were Muchan. Mao, what's the status of these animals of Muktzah as far as Hakrav al Gabi Mizbeach? And the question was asked to either Rav Chisda or to Rav Huna, and you reported back to us the answer that you got from either Rav Huna or Rav Chisda. At Amrit Law, Allah, in other words, you gave us an answer from either Rav Chisda or Rav Huna based on a brisa, and the answer was that, and I'm going to read the whole pasuk here because the Gemara only quotes part of the pasuk. Pasuk is in Sefer Yechezkel, and it says with regard to Avos Karbanos, it says V'seh achas min atzon min amasayim mimashke Yisrael. So let's focus on the word seh. And mimashke Yisrael means that it's something that you're allowed to eat, or in this case, you're allowed to drink. And the drasha from this pasuk in the brisa is as follows. Seh, now the word seh is generic. It means it includes both a zachar or an nekeva. That's the nature of the word seh. And if this carbon, which you have to bring, has to be roy, it has to be fit for the Mizbeach, and that's what Yechezkel is teaching us over here. It's got to be Mimashke Yisrael in order to be fit for the Mizbeach. And you have to bring something that's roy, right? Because Yechezkel used the word seh to be either a zachar or a nekeva. And this is coming to exclude bechar, because bechar can only be from a zachar. V'lo ha-bechar. So if, let's say, the firstborn, the Peter Rechem, was a nekeva, it does not have kedushas bechar, because bechar only applies to a zachar. He has a discussion here how we derive this halacha that a bechar has to be from a zachar, and it's based on a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. It says, "Kol habechar sheyulad bibkarcha ubitzonecha hazachar takdish lashem elokecha." Can't get more explicit than that. So the Torah in the Parashat Bechar in Dvarim Perek Tesvav says zachar. Okay. Now it says v'seh achas. Now, what is the meaning of v'seh achas? So he says the following: V'seh achas, which means one single, how do you say seh in English? Not a lamb. Is it a lamb? Yeah, a lamb, I think. Yeah. So it's one lamb, not a whole group of what we call tzon. In other words, if Yechezkel was referring to tzon, he would have said seh achas min hatzon. The seh achas min hatzon means that there's only one seh. And this is teaching us the word achas, that the carbon that he has to bring is got to be alone. What does it mean alone? Se achas, levada. Velo, it's coming to exclude maser, which means if, let's say, you have an animal that is one of 10 animals, then we have to be mafresh 1 out of the 10. And that's not considered se achas. Because se achas means who was never part of a group, a larger group. So we're excluding now the case of maser behema. And then the pasuk goes on, as we saw, and it says minatzon. Minatzon is a miut. It's got to be se achas minatzon, velo kol atzon. And that means that for karbonos, where the Torah says to bring, for example, a keves, velo apalgos. Apalgos is not included under keves. It's too young to be an ayal, which is a little bit older, and it's too old to be a keves. So keves is usually the first year, ayal is the third year, and then we have the palgos in between. Here he has in the footnote, keves hu betoch shna soso rishona, ayal hu acher shekvar ola olav chodesh sholem b'shna shniya. Oh, right. It's considered as if it already completed its second year because it was 1 month into the second year. V'achar shenasa ben shana ad she'overlov chodesh b'shnasa shniya dehainu chodesh b'toch sholosh. Okay, fine. And then it's called a palgos, which is not roy lekarbon. It's neither a keves nor an ayil. It falls in between the cracks. Now we go on in the pasuk in Yechezkel. It says v'seachas min hatzon min hamosayim. Hey, none of this is really relevant to us, but we want to get to Mimashki Yisrael at the end of the pasuk. And the Gemara says here on the top of Memchesim and Aleph, min hamasayim, that if he was mafresh the carbon itself, what does it mean, min hamasayim? It must be a reference to something else entirely. And that is the accompaniment with the carbon, which is called the sachim. And it's telling you that if the yayin was a mixture of yayin shel orla together with yayin shel heter, then you're allowed to bring these nesachim mimosar shtemios shenishtayru b'bar. Umikali orla shebetelu b'masayim. Anyway, the phrase mimasayim is coming to teach you the halacha of bittul in a case of taruvos yayin shel orla, and it's batul b'masayim. Oh, now we get to the main purpose of this brisa for our purposes, and that is mimashki Yisrael. At the end of this pasuk, Yechezkel says that karbanos have to come mimashki Yisrael min hamutar li Yisrael min hamutar b'ficha, meaning that which you're allowed to eat. So let's say, for example, you wanted to take the sachim of yayin shel orla, that would be possible in mizbeach because it's not min hamutar b'ficha. So we mentioned the case of orla, and the Gemara is mentioning and focusing on the case of teva. The brisa continues. Yachol, I might think that when it says you're not allowed to bring nisachim from teva lo yavi mina mukta on Shabbos, you can't bring a carbon on the mizbeach, or on Yom Tov for that matter, right? Shabbos and Yom Tov from mukta. So let's say, for example, you had yayin that was mukta. For some reason, he put it away, and he decided he's not going to use it on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Then it's not included in mimashke Yisrael min hamutar Yisrael. is therefore such yayin would be excluded from the mizbeach. This is all yachol, is what I might think. Or Marta, no, we don't interpret it that way. Ma tevel miyuchat shisur begufo, that the Isur machmas atzmo is garam lo, that generated the Isur to the Israel, therefore you can't bring the Sachem from Tevel. Af kol sheisuro gufo garam lo, there's something inherent to the object that generates the Isur. Yotzo mukta, she'eni suro gufo garam lo, ela Isur davar ach. In other words, it's also not because it's macholas asura, it's not a chefta di surah. Muksa is only also because of Shabbos or because of Yom Tov garam. So therefore, you would be allowed to bring niske yayin from yayin of muktzah. And if that be the case, we have an answer to the question of a sed that came from the afar, from the acho. He came from very far away on Yom Tov, and you're allowed to shecht it for a carbon tamid on Yom Tov and be makriv it on the mizbeach on Yom Tov because it is not considered mimashki Yisrael, because it's not gufo garamlo. It's not that the Isur is inherent in the object. It's only the zman. I mean, the same object, which we call a sed that came from Muktzah land, would be mutter during the entire week on a day of Chol. Now Abai comes to his punchline. The Iyamrit Isur Muktzah Doraisa. If, according to you, Rabbah, you get Malkus for using Atzei Asherah, Mali Isa Gufa, I'm sorry, Atzei Muksa, I meant to say, Mali Isa Gufa, Mali Isa Davar Acher. Mimashki Yisrael means that it's Heter. This is not Heter. So what? It's not Isa Machmas Davar Acher. Okay, it's Isa Machmas Davar Acher, but you're telling me that Muksa is Doraisa. In other words, Abai doesn't understand the distinction between two categories of Isur that are being excluded and disqualified for the Mizbeach under Mimashki Yisrael. One category being Gufo Garam Lo Lesa Isur, and the other is where the Zman is Garam Isur. It's Machmas Dover Acher. What difference to make? The Torah says in Yechezkel that only Mimashki Yisrael is kosher Mizbeach. But that which is not mimashki Yisrael is not kosher mizbeach. So the Isur of shtias nesachim of muktzah, and for that matter, the shchita of a sed that came mina acho, mina efer, min ofar, is asur, whether you call it machmas gufo or call it machmas dover acher. It doesn't fit into the category of the requirement of mimashki Yisrael. So that's the kasha that Abaye asked and he raised against Rabbah. How can Rabbah you say that there's an Isur Muktzah Doraisa? If there's an Isur Muktzah Doraisa, that should passel the Karban L'Mizbeach under the halach, the requirement of Mimashki Yisrael. So Mr. Shem, tomorrow we'll try to analyze Rabbah's defense and his answer to this question. Okay then? So let me wish you all a great day and Hemshei Chanukah Sameach.